it's a very culturally diverse environment that we live in. And so I think we have to embrace that, and the work that's being created now has to reflect that, because I think that's important. For the arts being created now should reflect the time we live in.
That's what I would say to the Obama administration. Consider each country and its own interest and its own peculiar history in relation to the others, and be very careful, because you've got a complicated situation which could, if you aren't very careful about how you proceed, could be explosive.
Basically, at this point, what elected officials are looking at is, they don't want to ruin our water supplies either, but they're under tremendous pressure from the oil and gas industry, which is a major industry, throwing millions of dollars around in lobbying and ad campaigns.
You have no sympathy whatsoever for the Sikhs that were murdered in Wisconsin.
No, I have no personal sympathy because I didn't know any of them or anything else, and
but they were human beings, with all due respect.
Well, they would be alive human beings if they'd have stayed in the area where they come from in Asia.
The two that President Obama is going to win hands down is definitely going to be Ohio and Virginia.
Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. The following is an excerpt from a 2002 article written by Stephen Gray, a reporter and member of the National Association of Black Journalists, in recognition of the 30th anniversary of the landmark 1972 discrimination suit filed by 7 reporters against the Washington Post. The group became known as the Metro 7. In August, 6 former Washington Post reporters met at a colleague's home for a commemoration, not to mark the 30th anniversary of the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, but of a landmark Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaint charging the newspaper with discrimination against its black employees. The case, believed to be the first of its kind against a major American newspaper, arguably accelerated the hiring and promotion of scores of journalists of color. More important, it helped solidify the role of black journalists in the interpretation of contemporary American history. Yet, it seems the complaint and its significance has largely been ignored. I recently contacted Metro 7 member Mike Hodge and extended an invitation to discuss his career, the editorial policies and racial atmosphere at the Washington Post, then and now, and the current state of journalism in America. Mr. Hodge graciously accepted, and he now joins us via Skype. Welcome, Mr. Hodge.
Thank you. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good.
I'd like to begin the discussion by asking what inspired you to become a journalist?
I've always been, if you will, inspired to write. The first toy I ever actually remember having is a typewriter. And when a lot of other kids were outside playing, I was inside putting my thoughts on paper. And as a result of that, when I think I belonged to the 4-H and the Boy Scouts, and because I wrote, I would write whatever that organization was. And then we had the 4-H Club, for instance. We were able to put information in the newspaper, and I usually became the guy that did that. And then as a result of that, when I got into high school, junior high school initially, my school had a column in the paper. I was the one who was chosen to do it. And then in high school, I became the school editor. All of it was kind of by happenstance, just because I liked to write and I liked words. I never intended to become a journalist. I actually wanted to become a creative writer. But my mom, a lovely woman, still living, she said, "We're not going to spend all that money for you to go to school and starve to death." So I became a journalist.
What type of training did you receive?
I went to West Virginia University School of Journalism, and it was interesting the way that I got into that school. As I said, I was the editor of the school paper in my senior year. The School of Journalism at WVU had a seminar every year for the high schools around the state. And I remember the year that we did it, it was in Beckley, West Virginia, which is about a 2-hour drive from where I grew up in Gary, West Virginia. And I remember that we had to get up at like 3 o'clock in the morning to get up, get dressed, and to leave by, we left at 5 to get there by 7 because the seminar started at 8, and we had to start registration and have breakfast and all that kind of stuff. And I was the editor. So they had 3 of us who came. It was my supervisor, myself, and the associate editor. And you get there and you sign up, and you sign up for the class. And there was a morning session and an afternoon session. And what I remember is I signed up for, I don't remember what the session was. When I came into the room, there were other people in the room already, and everybody was sitting near the back. And I thought that was rude, so I sat up front because I thought somebody needed to be engaged with the teacher. And then this guy comes in, a short, middle-aged man who comes in and introduces himself. And instantly at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm thinking, this is not good. Later, I found out that the people at school called him Mumbles because he just mumbled all the way through the class. And it was like I think a 3-hour seminar. He would ask if there were questions, and I'd look around, and people were sleeping, including teachers, the supervisors. People were sleeping and completely disengaged. Again, I thought it was rude. So he would ask if there were questions, and I would begin to ask questions. I would come up with things to do. When the class was over, he came up to me and he asked me what my name was. He told me how impressed he was with me, etc. And then I later found out that he was the dean of the journalism school. Now, the other thing that I will say is at the time that I was in school, the schools of West Virginia were still segregated. That year, my being at that seminar was kind of an anomaly in a way because it was an integrated scenario, and we were, the 3 of us, my supervisor and the 2 students, were, if I can recall correctly, the only black students there. At any rate, he talked to my supervisor at lunch. She then told me how impressed he was, and he asked for my parents' information. And she was excited because I was going to get the opportunity to go to journalism school. I wasn't because I didn't want to be a journalist. But I moved on, and I felt good that he had thought highly of me. But what he didn't know is I was just trying to be polite. And then what was really stunning to me, though, was whatever the class was I signed up for in the afternoon just happened to be taught by Mumbles. So I was as tired as I was. I had to be equally as engaged in the afternoon as I was in the evening. But to finish the story, he did indeed get in touch with my parents, and they were beginning to integrate the journalism school. And he was in search of black students. And he told my mom, if you allow him to go here, we will make sure that, you won't have to worry about anything. Even if he doesn't get scholarships, we will just make sure that he gets what he needs to get his education. And so my mom said, this is where you're going. And that's what I did. And he did look out for me. And I actually, my senior year, the American Association of Newspaper Publishers was having annual convention, I think it was, in New York, and they had it at the Waldorf Astoria. And I was invited, along with 3 other students, to come and sit on the panel. I didn't believe it at first because I had never heard of these people. I was a senior in college. But my dean had actually referred me to them. And I showed up. First time on a plane, first time in New York, I'm staying at the Waldorf Astoria. Love that. And the panel was maybe for half an hour, 45 minutes on a Tuesday morning. I don't know why I remember that. And they allowed us to stay as long as we wanted. I think I stayed about 5 days. But what was great about it, there was myself, the African American, and 3 other people, 2 white guys, one considered a liberal, the other considered a conservative, and a woman. I remember the woman was from the University of Texas because they had just had a sniper shooting from the tower, bell tower down there. And she was the editor of their paper that took care of that story. But the good thing about it, we were in front of all the major newspaper publishers and editors in the country. And we were all juniors or seniors. I think there was 1 junior, the other 3 were seniors, and all of us got really great job offers. The person who conducted the panel, one of the 2, was actually the managing editor of the Washington Post, and that's how I ended up at the Washington Post. And I just read that he died. At this moment, his name escapes me, Eugene Patterson. He just died a couple of weeks ago. But he was the one who moderated that panel, one of the guys who moderated the panel. The other was from the Chicago Sun-Times. And but all of us got great job offers.
When you started working for the Post, do you remember the first story that you worked on?
The first story that I remember that I did, and it still stays with me, was about a change that the police department had made in their recruitment scenario.
D.C. Police Department.
I'm sorry?
The D.C. Police Department.
Yes, right, the D.C. Police Department. And what the story was about, the result of that change. They previously had required, I believe, only either a 11th or 12th grade education and no experience of any sort. And what they often got, I was told by the person who I was interviewing for the story, they often got a lot of white guys, rednecks, if you will, from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, who wanted to come to the nation's capital to train the animals in the jungle, as it were. That's how they often described it. And they would come up, get on the police force, live in Prince George's County, which is one of the counties in Maryland, right across the border from Washington, D.C. And at that point, it was largely a white, almost rural kind of county. And it was known for being sort of redneck, which is interesting because right next to it is Montgomery County, which has always been one of the richest counties in the country. But the thing about both of them is at the time, they were both very, very white. But the change in the department required, I think they began to ask then for either 1 or 2 years of college. And I know that the other thing that they required was that you have to live in the district, not necessarily in the precinct that you worked for. In fact, they didn't particularly want you to live in the precinct that you worked for, but they did want you to live in the district so that you had an affinity for the district and you had an appreciation for the people that you were working with or policing, if you will. And it was a major success for the department in terms of getting rid of police brutality complaints, the abuse complaints, and just generally speaking, created a much better working relationship with the community. And I don't know if things have changed since then, but I do remember that when I lived in D.C., the communication between the community and the police department actually was pretty good.
Did you ever have any reason to believe or suspect that race would play a factor when you decided to become a journalist?
I never thought about it, really. As I said, I grew up in a segregated environment, and ironically, because it was a very small town, race was not a big part of my purview. I never thought about it. My parents and I never discussed it. One of the things I'd like to give them credit for is they did not give me a reason to hate anybody. When we had difficulties, we talked about them in general, non-judgmental terms. What I remember, or what I know, is that when we went to church like 30 miles away from home every Sunday, that's because it's the church my mom grew up in. And I remember that, sometimes 30 miles over hills and valleys and all that kind of stuff can take about an hour and a half sometimes. And sometimes you're traveling in the afternoon and you haven't had a chance to have lunch or whatever, and you're going to stop and get a meal. And there were times when I'd go, let's stop here. And my dad wouldn't say anything. My mom wouldn't say anything. We'd just keep on driving. And we never talked about it. And then there were places that we always stopped. And I later found out it was because we wouldn't have gotten served had we stopped there.
As history clearly shows, race did become a factor in your career, though. However, you and 6 other reporters did something extraordinary to change that and the state of journalism in America. Now, for those who may not be aware, especially young people, describe what the Metro 7 did that completely transformed the Washington Post and the news industry.
It's interesting because I think when we did it, I don't think we thought of it in terms of being as big as it probably was eventually, because all we were trying to do is create an environment where we could work comfortably. But with the help of lawyer Cliff Alexander, who had been the first chair of the federal EEOC, we filed a claim with the federal EEOC against the Washington Post for racism, which initially Ben Bradley and a lot of the staff were just stunned by. They couldn't figure out how they could be racist when they, in fact, had probably the largest, in sheer numbers if nothing else, but percentage of black reporters or employees than any other newspaper across the country. But once they read our list of demands, if you will, he began to understand. A number of the demands had nothing to do with racism per se. They had a lot to do with simply being fair across the board.
And there were two specific complaints that the group lodged involving the absence of black assignment editors. That being
there were I think there was a list of maybe 18 or 20, and most of them were resolved once we were able to sit down and talk to Mr. Bradley. But the one that was the biggest, that really served everybody well, was the fact that when you got an assignment, you'd go and do the story, an editor would read it. This happened especially if it were a feature story or a story that was not on a time deadline. You'd have an editor would read it, and then they'd give you notes, and you'd go and you'd redo the story, and then you'd put it back in the inbox, and another editor might read it who would have a completely different take on it. And my experience with that was a story I had done about Anacostia. Don't remember exactly what was in the story, but I do remember that my editor loved the story, but I was missing a couple of things, and there were 3 questions that he thought I should answer. And he listed them, and I don't remember what those were now. But one of those 3 things that was an issue was my lead. He thought I had buried it. He thought the 3rd paragraph should be the 1st paragraph. So when I got the story again, I inverted the 3rd and 1st paragraphs, and I answered the 3 questions that he'd asked me to answer. When I handed the story in again, it was picked up by another editor. I'll tell you, the editor that got it the second time, I had respected long before I even knew the guy that had gotten it the first time. At any rate, when he got it, he said, "Oh, you buried your lead." And he pointed to the 3rd paragraph, the paragraph that had been my lead. And then he said, "You've got all this extraneous information." And all that extraneous information was the answers to those 3 questions that this one editor had asked me to do. So every single thing I had added as a result of the first editor, the second editor was saying, "Take it out." And that can be kind of frustrating. So anyway, what they decided to do as a result of our demands was to...
I'm sorry, was this only happening for the black reporters on staff?
This is one of those things that was good for everybody. It was happening to everybody.
It's happening to everybody.
Yeah, okay. That was one. Now, the one that was just for black reporters, what they did was, if you were the editor that got the story the first time, you would shepherd the story all the way through. That's one. The other one was when you, as a black reporter, first of all, particularly when we first got there, and I say when we first got there, if I can backtrack a bit, when Dr. King was killed, and there was rioting in the street, and the Post sent reporters out to try to cover the story, none of the black spokespeople would speak to anybody unless they were black. And they didn't have any black reporters. So they had to send their news aides and copy aides out to cover the stories because those were the only black people in the newsroom. And they realized that they were going to have to start to hire black and Latin people eventually, but at that point it was black people. And I was probably in the 2nd year of that hiring process. I was in the 2nd wave. It was the 1st year of that hiring process. They had no way to really understand how to deal with us. So consequently, as a black reporter, what you got were black assignments, meaning you covered the black story. What was frustrating was you'd come back with the story and the editor would question your veracity because whatever you came back with didn't fit his idea And I say his because that's who the editors were then. They were all white editors. They didn't fit his idea of what the black community was about. So it was really frustrating having to fight that battle on a regular basis. So one of the other things we got was a black editor who could give us assignments, who could read the stories, who could actually have interaction with the other editors that they were inclined to actually acknowledge and deal with. So we got a perspective and a voice on the editor's desk, which really helped tremendously.
Can you cite one example of in-your-face racism?
No, actually, in-your-face is not something that happens at a sophisticated organization. And I don't think that, and the other part of it is, one of the things that I learned, and I remember thinking this in the newsroom one day, how excited I was that I was going to be working for the Washington Post because it was such a wonderfully liberal organization. But I had not taken into account that it was still run by individuals, some of whom were literally racist. None of them ever, especially if you're in a liberal environment, you don't think of yourself as racist. You just think of what the truth is, whether you have anything to back that up or not. So, a couple of years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who worked at the time at 2020. She was a producer, and she was having a conversation, an editorial meeting about some stories that were coming up, and she was doing a story about black couples or something. And one of the editors said to her, "Everybody knows that all black men beat their wives." Now, she would not have thought of herself as racist. My friend was completely and totally stunned. But that's an absolutely racist statement to make. And so people do those kinds of things, not necessarily out of malice, because I consider in-your-face racism as being fairly malicious. And so that doesn't happen in generally sophisticated and or educated scenarios. Not that it doesn't happen, but I don't recall that I ever experienced it.
Did the Metro 7 receive a great deal of support from white colleagues at the Post?
Initially, there was some concern, there was some grumbling, etc. But then once they realized that what we were about, while we did help ourselves, we actually helped the newsroom. And even something like getting the black editor, they saw how it affected everything in a positive way. We actually got, before we even got to that point, we got a lot of support. And in fact, the women filed the same kind of claim after we were successful. So there was no real pushback. There was some fear and some expressed concern about creating upset in the newsroom. But in fact, one of the people who was one of the black columnists who worked with us, he was against our doing it initially because I think his concern was that it was going to be a bit too confrontational. But that's not what we were doing. We were trying to simply write things that had never been addressed in the newsroom.
At the time that the complaint was filed, you arrived at the paper when, 1960, 67, 69?
69.
Was Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein,
No.
Were they currently working at the paper?
Yeah, Bernstein was there. Bernstein and I actually shared a desk. That was before the building was expanded. The newspaper itself was expanding and had not yet expanded its base. So when I first got there, Carl was working the day shift, I was working the night shift, and we literally had to share a desk. And I think our shifts overlapped by maybe an hour or so, but that wasn't a big deal because he was often out, or one of us was out during that portion of the day, so that wasn't a big deal. Woodward came in, I think, maybe in 71, and I was working at the police station then, and I remember I trained him at the police station. That was so many years ago.
Was the late Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist Carl T. Rowan working at the publication?
No, he was a syndicated writer, and he worked out of his own offices. So, unfortunately, I never met him. This is a total aside, but my dad, when he found out that I got the job at the Washington Post, was so excited because his favorite columnist was Drew Pearson, and Drew Pearson worked for the Washington Post, and I was Really kind of sad to tell him that, no, I never met Drew because Drew was syndicated, which meant he had his own offices and he didn't work literally for the Post. They simply carried his columns. That's what happened with Carl. I think Carl may have been in the newsroom once or twice, but I can't call him, I met him, but I can't say that we were ever friends. I met him as a black journalist who worked at the Washington Post.
And I understand you have a great fondness for the late William Raspberry.
Oh, yeah. Bill Raspberry was really, he was a gem in so many ways. Actually, he was the one who was kind of concerned about the Metro 7. I believe we were 9. We might have actually even started off as 11. And then people got concerned because, people they care about whether or not they lose their job. For me, and I think for most of us on the Metro 7, we'd gotten to a point where the frustration level was so great that I know for myself, I can say that. I can't say for anybody else. I know I didn't care if they fired me over this or not. I thought that the issues that at hand were valid. Bill was concerned that it would create kind of a bad taste with management and upset the apple cart for everybody. Now, he did fall in line with us as he found out more and more about how we were going to do it. And we did have the good fortune to have Bob Maynard as one of our advisors. We took this all very, very seriously, and we approached it in a slow and considered way. Bob Maynard is, I can't remember now what it's called, but it's the school. It's not a school of journalism, but there's a training ground that's on the West Coast. I think it's in Oakland. And I do know that he became the first black publisher of a major daily, the Oakland Tribune. Unfortunately, he died of cancer a couple of years after he bought it. But he, with the support of the Washington Post, the management, he made that purchase. So he was somebody who understood the inside job and how to navigate those realms, and he aided us tremendously. And also Cliff. We had wanted to file a lawsuit, and Cliff said, no, I think you'd be better served if you file a discrimination complaint. One, it won't cost so much money, but two, you will also get the same effect. So, and I think we did that.
As far as you know, 40 years or so later, has the atmosphere or situation improved at the Washington Post?
Oh, yeah, considerably. Not that long after I left, actually, we've had a couple of local columnists. We had I don't remember names right now, but we had a black Metro editor. I'm sure we've had a black city editor as well.
The deputy managing editor, Mr. Milton Coleman, right? Right,
yes. Yeah, Milton was first, I believe, I think he was first the Metro editor, then he became a managing editor, and he's recently, I believe, if he's not retired, he's going to. And I just was reading the other day that there was someone else who was promoted to an associate or managing editor of in a particular area. So yeah, the ability to move up and to have input has actually improved greatly. And I will say that Donald Graham, who's now the publisher, he's Katharine Graham's oldest son. What I remember about Donald, and he and I are basically, I think, the same age, but they've been really open, kind people. What I know about him is one of the reporters who was from Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, whose parents had sent him east to go to a boarding school to avoid all the sturm and drang about that happened in the public schools and integration, et cetera, in Arkansas. Herb Denton, that's his name. He's since passed away as well. But he was one of Donald Graham's roommates at Harvard. And as a result of all that, they got to be really great friends. And in fact, Herb Denton was almost like one of Katharine's children. When he got out of college, rather than coming to work at the newspaper, which everybody knew he was going to do, he went to work for the police department because it was his belief and the newspaper's belief that the best way to get to know the city was by its policing. So he worked at the police department, I know, for a year, maybe even two, And then when he came to work for the newspaper, he went to work in the printing room. He worked in the printing presses. He got to know how that worked. Then he came and I think he went up to the advertising department for a while. And then he came down to the newsroom and worked as a reporter before eventually moving his way upstairs and now to publisher. But he was very much an egalitarian. He wanted to know what your issues were and if you had difficulty and if things were working out the way they were supposed to. So I always felt comfortable and comforted when he was around, although I think I was there for I don't believe he was there when we filed these claims. I didn't think he came until later.
I'd like to move the conversation to the present state of journalism.
Okay.
Bill McCreary, Les Payne, and the late Gil Noble are legendary journalists that had earned numerous awards throughout their career. But with all due respect, they never obtained the same level of visibility as their white counterparts Tom Brokaw, Mike Wallace, or Peter Jennings. McCreary, Payne, and Noble are household names, but the majority of those households are black. To date, aside from Max Robinson, no black has hosted a nightly news program on a major network. Moreover, Connie Chung, Katie Couric, and most recently Christiane Amanpour appear to be exercises in futility. Do you have a theory as to why high-profile black reporters and women continue to have problems obtaining or maintaining coveted time slots at major networks?
Well, actually, when you look at what happened in the election, this last election, 2000 and 2012, and you look at the division that exists in the country, there are so many people, and this is the thing that really bothers me, and to some degree actually even surprises me. I had thought we had made a tremendous amount of progress over the years since Dr. King had his march and the Voting Rights Act had been passed and things seem to have been equal, but there's still a considerable division. When you have Sunday as the most racially segregated time in our country, you have a problem. When churches are supposed to be about, love and brotherhood and all that, yet white people go to white churches and black people go to black churches. When you watch television, the country is used to watching white people. Consequently, it gets hard. It's not as hard as it used to be. And I don't think it's going to be long before you'll see the kinds of changes that you're talking about. But we still do have a considerable amount of work to do. And the more we have the conservative brand demonizing anybody who isn't a white man, you're going to have those problems. Once we start to see each other as completely equal and the same, as we really are, unless, if you're stupid and somebody else is not, then that's not equal. But just as general human beings, we're all the same. And I will say that the younger generation, at least the 2 generations down, they are actually seeing the world that way because they go to really mixed race schools and they watch a lot of mixed race television. At a point, it won't really matter who's doing it as long as they're good. Right now, President Obama has more security on him. He's gotten more death threats than any president ever, and they continue. And it's only because he's black.
Do you truly believe that?
I do. I absolutely do. It has nothing to do with it may have to do with some of his policies. But from the beginning, when he first started to run back in 2006 or 7 or whenever it was, they assigned him Secret Service well before the normal time to assign Secret Service to presidential candidates because of the number of threats that he was getting. And at that point, nobody knew who he was, so that wasn't even a policy issue. That clearly was about the fact that he was a black man running for president. The reason that he continues to be questioned in terms of his birth, and the conservatives have made a huge effort to otherize him, make him somebody who's not American. And the only way they can do that is because he's black.
And overall, how would you describe the current state of journalism in America?
Kind of abominable. I think it was Reagan who started it. I believe it was Clinton who made another change. When I was a journalist, there was something called fair and balanced, and it meant fair and balanced and not what Fox News calls fair and balanced. What I do know is radio and TV stations, especially the networks, the free ones, the public ones, were seen as a public trust. That's from the very beginning. That the airwaves belonged to the public. As a result, anybody who wanted to run a television network or own a television station or a radio station had to adhere to certain kinds of principles. One, I think it was every 7 years they had to apply for their license. And part of that application was a commitment to public service. It was about public service, which is why you had people who did public service programming, and you had valuable news organizations. None of it was about making money. It was about service to the public. They would have their social or entertaining programming to make their money. The CBS was once called, for a long time, the Tiffany Network, because they spent a lot of money on their news programming. You had Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow, people who were legendary, and a lot of people, even 60 Minutes, the way that they worked, because they were given as much as they needed to get the story done. Back in the day, all of those organizations had bureaus in other countries. Herb Denton passed away when he was assigned to Canada. I forget which province he was in, but he lived in Canada for quite a few years covering Canadian stories for the Washington Post. When I first met Leon Dash, who was one of the Metro 7, he was in Africa. He'd gone over to Africa as a member of Peace Corps and had begun working for the Washington Post while he was over there. And we had another editor or reporter in Russia, somebody somewhere in Asia, and we did have somebody in the Middle East, and we had somebody in the London Bureau. There were bureaus around the world, and they were always situated close enough to the center that they could move quickly to any place in that country or on that continent that had a hotspot, and they had access to other writers there. But over the last few years, those bureaus have been closed in terms of saving money. They actually get their reports, international reports, from pretty much the same sources, all news agencies or news organizations. And there's no obligation to be fair or balanced. And in some scenarios, there's no obligation even to be honest. And nobody does public service anymore, so there's no obligation to the public. Much of what is passing for news is done under the aegis of profit making. It's not a nonprofit entity anymore. They make money, so they do the stories that they know people will want to hear, rather than the stories that the public needs to know.
You mentioned Fox News earlier, and in April of 2012, Roger Ailes, chairman and CEO of Fox News, addressed about 350 students, which included journalism students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Ailes basically told the journalism students to consider changing their major if they were going into journalism because they cared. What do you think of his statement?
Well, from his perspective, that is absolutely the truth, because he has a political agenda. What they do has nothing to do with news. It has nothing to do with information. It has everything to do with being politically expedient and trying to guide the story, creating the story, making the story what they want it to be. And consequently, what journalism is about doesn't really speak to him. I don't think he is actually a journalist. I believe he was a political operative before he became involved with Fox News. I'm pretty certain he used to work for Reagan.
So there's nobody on board at Fox that you believe is quote-unquote a quality journalist or is involved in quality journalism?
Well, I will say that there are two people whose work I used to respect. I can't say that I don't respect it now because I actually don't spend a lot of time watching Fox. But Britt Hume was somebody who was, I believe he was an ABC reporter, and of course,
yes.
Chris Wallace is the son of you know.
The late Mike Wallace, yes.
And I believe, there are times that I've been surprised that Chris is actually beginning. I don't think he always was while he was over there, but he's now beginning to really practice real journalism. Because one of the things that I have noticed that they've always done at Fox is they go easy on the people who are on their side. And Chris Wallace has begun to actually not do that. He will question John McCain as hard as he would anybody from the Democratic side. And Brit Hume, I'm not sure about. Because, again, I don't watch Fox as much as I probably should. As a number of my friends say, you need to know what the opposition's doing. But at the point that I feel they're just making things up, and a lot of them, it just feels like that's all they do is make things up. Or they make conjecture. And one of the things you are not to do if you are a journalist is make conjecture about anything. If you've got some information, yeah. If you can source it, but if you can't, then keep your mouth shut. And they do a lot of conjecture.
And a number of recent news reports have indicated that their ratings have seen a dramatic decline. Would you attribute everything that you've said as the reason for this decline?
I think that what's happening is people are beginning to become aware that they are not honest. I know that for a long time, people paid attention to them as if they were the Bible. The numbers of times I have read things on my Twitter feed or on Facebook page about some story that the mainstream press is not dealing with, and it turns out that it was something that they'd heard from Fox News. In fact, a story that was created by Fox News was the new Black Panther Party. Those three guys standing outside I think it was either two or three, standing outside a polling area in Pennsylvania constituted the new Black Panther Party. They actually stoked that story so much and fed that story so much that people began to believe that it was an actual movement afoot. It was not. Never has been. But it became a mainstream news story because Fox pushed it as such. And it's part of their whole thing about, and it's not I don't think this is part of the entire organization, but there are some who actually push the idea of a coming race war. And that was part of that discussion.
One more question about the network. Can you give me one word summary of Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity?
One word, that's hard. Performers, what is it? Clown shows. When it comes to the shows that they do, they're interested in pushing a point of view. That's not news. It's not actually really even an honest, real discussion when you push a point of view. You have a discussion to make a discovery. And they already know how it's supposed to end, and they push the discussion to end where they want it to prove their point. And if that doesn't happen, then they either end the conversation or they go off and find somebody else who will take it where they want it to go. Or they will demonize the person who doesn't go with where they want it to go. It's extraordinarily sad that they get, multi-million dollars a year to misguide, mislead, misinform the public.
A majority of the people in this country, unfortunately, are not aware of your amazing story or what you and the Metro 7 accomplished. Another thing that they may not be aware of is that you're currently the president of the New York division of the Screen Actors Guild. How did you become affiliated with SAG?
Well, I would say, just a little correction. It's no longer the Screen Actors Guild. It's the Screen Actors Guild / American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, or SAG-AFTRA.
Right. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
We merged last year, and as a result, I am now co-president until there is another election, which will happen this summer, I believe. But after I left the newspaper, I did public relations for a while, and then not too long after that, I did the public relations while trying to decide what the hell am I going to do for the rest of my life. And I ruled out being a journalist. I was supposed to write, but I didn't yet. But I did become an actor. And that's how I ended up in New York. I've been here for, God knows, a long time. And at some point, I've always been pro-union. I was a member of the Journalism Guild, of course. My father was a coal miner, and he talked a lot about the value of unions. And SAG has always been, it was actually not my parent. My parent was Equity, and then that's a stage union. And then I started doing some other things and became a member of AFTRA, and then I became a member of SAG, and I made the bulk of my money in SAG. And then in 2000, we had a commercial strike, and after doing some research, I found out that it was a strike that we probably could have avoided. But we were then, not all, but a good portion of our leadership was not as union savvy as I personally think that they should have been. And after a couple of friends asked me if I would run for the board, I considered it and thought, well, I don't know enough about the business of this union, but if nothing else, I could at least be a good placeholder. I wouldn't get in the way of anybody who had good ideas, and I could possibly come up with some ideas of my own. And so I ran and got on the board in 2001, I believe it was. And I didn't expect that I would still be here 12 years later. But I am, and about 3.5 years ago, I decided to run for the presidency of the New York division of the Screen Actors Guild. And I won, and we've actually been able to do some really good things. As it turns out, I am the first African-American president in the Screen Actors Guild in its entire, I think it would be like 70, wait a minute, we're 80 years old, I believe. 82. We were 82 years old before we died, before we merged, if you will. And there'd never been a black president, either nationally or divisionally. So I feel fairly proud of the fact that I'm the first.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Are there any members of the union or any celebrities, for that matter, that are familiar with your background with the Metro 7?
Not a whole lot. No, I don't talk about it much, and the Metro 7 is not a huge part of any conversation. I will say that what's very interesting to me is that a number of people I know have either followed the path from journalism to acting or from acting to journalism. I don't know what that is, but I know any number of people who have made that trek.
You have the floor, sir. Is there anything else in particular that you'd like to say?
No, I think I'm pretty good. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to actually remember some of these things and to kind of explore them. I will say this. You had asked me at some point about why we had, as the Metro 7, had not gotten the recognition that you think that we should be getting. I think at the time that it happened, the numbers of black reporters were so small that there was no. In fact, that was before we even had a Black Journalists Association. There was no organization. I believe this happened at a time when we were beginning to organize the black journalists, so that there was no place to actually think about commemorating. It's like building the plane, flying the plane at the same time, that whole deal. And the truth is, I don't think any of us actually expected or wanted any kind of acknowledgement. We just wanted to be able to work in an environment and create an environment for those who followed us that would be more effective for everybody than it had been for us while we were there.
Well, we clearly still have a long way to go in accomplishing that goal. But newsrooms all across this nation have undoubtedly been transformed because your group had the courage to stand up and speak out. It's truly been an honor to have you on the show, Mr. Hodge. And if I may say so, on behalf of every American journalist of color, past, present, and future, I thank you and the Metro 7 for your defiance, determination, and your diligence.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the G-Man Interviews. I'm the G-Man. And until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.